On today's show,
the dreaded blank page. When people start writing a book, one of the biggest questions I get is, how do you start? What do you begin with? And usually when I ask them what they've tried, they open up a Word document and they type chapter 1. On today's episode, you're going to see the real way that most authors do that one and give you a few tips to get started to avoid the blank page and to start out developing the content you're going to need to make an awesome, compelling nonfiction book. Before you start writing a book, you want to start writing the book. And that means to go out and gather the compelling content you're going to use in your book. And today we're going to learn from Dan Pink, a multi-time New York Times bestseller, the author of Drive, and all sorts of books that are really deeply thoughtful and really well researched. And we're going to learn how Dan prepares to write the book before he even writes the book. You're going to see a couple key things that you can use in order to prepare in advance. These aren't years and years and years, but how you can use several weeks and months to set you up to write a really compelling book. And again, before you write, we want to gather what we're going to write in order to help us figure out how we're going to make this into a compelling book. One of the things I thought was also interesting is your books they've got deep stuff in them. You do a lot of research, you do a lot of interviewing and these things. How do you know when you've got enough knowledge to move into the next phase of capturing? Because it's this dance here a little bit, right? Like to your point, you could spend a lifetime researching some of these subjects and never write a word or, write something that has that thinness. Have you figured any strategies there?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a really great question. And I don't know whether I have a strategy. I haven't. What I probably should do, I mean, it's interesting. I probably should be a little bit more observant of my own behavior or be more intentional about kind of getting to that decision-making surface. For me, and this is not going to be that useful, it is going to be it's a feel. This is totally not helpful to people, but it's more of like a feeling, and the feeling sometimes comes when I get a sense that I'm hearing the same thing over and over again.
The pattern towards
when I'm no longer, almost like when I'm no longer surprised. Okay, I've heard that. Okay, yep, and in some cases that's often. So I think that's a good. I think in terms of trying to give folks some practical takeaways. I think it's like when you're doing research and you're no longer surprised.
Right.
That ends up that's a pretty good signal. But it's hard because for me, I mean, because as you know, thank you for recognizing that. Like I do a lot of research for these books.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it is that most people like readers don't see most of the research that I do.
Yeah.
Most of it I don't use, and you have to be able just to deal with it. It's very I got very frustrated in the project that I'm working on right now because I did so much research and so much reading and analysis over the summer and in the spring on the topic that I'm working on now. And then when I got to actually writing it, I realized that huge portions of it I wasn't going to use. Yeah. There was one. I'll give you an example of it. So there's this one. I might even have it here. Okay, so hang on a second.
Yeah.
So I'm big on paper. I'm an old school kind of person. All right. Yep. I'm big on paper. This is not all of it, but this is so I've got so here is this is not even imagine this times 3. I don't know where the rest of it is. Okay, imagine this times 3. Okay, for like a particular topic that I'm writing about. Okay, and these are all pretty dense. These are all pretty dense academic papers. So I read through them. It probably took me, I don't know, maybe a total of a week, maybe more, of reading through. And what I did is, I read it through. I hand write a little summary on it. I do some stuff, and it turned out that over a week, let's call it 10 work days of research, I realized this is a paragraph.
Yeah.
And that's painful.
Yeah.
Now, part of me is well, crap. I did all the work.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point, I'm mature enough that I like sort of deal with that pain and say, okay, the only thing worse than doing a week's worth of research, 10 days worth of research that I end up being able to summarize in a paragraph. The only thing worse than that is actually torturing readers with material that I'm giving to them only because I withstood the pain of accumulating it.
Yeah, the ego problem, right? Well, this is something that's worth sharing. Even you probably don't care, but we should still share it that way. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, it's so that's one of the. So you know, you're not, if you're including all your research and all your interviews, you're not doing it right.
As Dan shares, one of the most important things you can do before you write a book is to go out and gather things to learn where the book's going to go and to figure out the content you can include in your book. One of the things that we talk a lot about is the phase before you ever start doing any writing is called the get smart phase. And in particular, for those of you writing a nonfiction book, one of the best things you can do for yourself is be very intentional about how you gather content to use in your book. It's a very different style of research that we encourage you to do in order to gather the stuff that's going to make your book compelling. So the first thing to know about writing great nonfiction books is this. Nonfiction books are driven by stories. In fact, when you break down some of the best and most beloved nonfiction books from the Brene Browns and Simon Sinek's and Adam Grant's, they all use an overwhelming amount of stories in teaching you about the topic. About 70 to 80% of your content will be driven by story. And those stories will come from your own personal experiences. They'll come from people that you interview and people that you research. So before you sit down and do any writing, my advice is to go out and be very strategic about how you're going to gather content. And that means 3 things that you should do before you sit down and even write a single word. Number 1, think about moments in your own life that may have inspired you to research, to understand, and to study more about whatever the topic is. We call these the moments that matter. Start by writing out a list of key things that happened in your life. And a moment should have 3 things: a date, a location, and some kind of action or dialogue. So think about those moments in your life that might be compelling stories that could help you learn more about the topic. Where are things that happened to you and what happened to you to do it? Number 2, go out and spend time on YouTube and podcasts. Remember, stories are so important. And the best things is that these platforms, YouTube and the podcast platforms, are really driven by first-person storytelling accounts. From interviews, from podcast interviews, from TED Talks, those are all first-person accounts from things. So go out and listen for stories that may teach you something about the subject. Don't judge them, don't worry about them, but if you go through them and say, that helped me learn something about whatever it is, write it down and just build a list here. My advice before you do any writing is try to come up with about 20 to 25 different stories that you hear from these various places. Again, podcast interviews, YouTube talks, TED Talks, those are great resources before you begin, and just build a list. So having about 6 to 8 moments that matter from your life, having about 20 things you've researched, and then last but not least, if you've gone out there and done this research, hopefully you found maybe a dozen or more people that have said some interesting things, but you want to learn more here. Those are people that you can do a traditional interview with, a sit-down interview with potentially. So that's the things that I would urge you to do before you sit down. Now, this isn't kind of research about facts and figures per se, because again, that stuff will come later. But as Dan talks about, so much of this is going down the rabbit hole. In particular, going down the rabbit hole to find stories that inspire you, things in your own life, things in the lives of others, and maybe people you want to have a further conversation with to know more. So the get smart phase, the phase before you do any writing, is just about gathering things. We're going to gather as much as we can, in particular focus on stories. So find those things that may be compelling stories that you've heard already or you learn along the way, things that are already out in the public domain, and put those on your list. Put out those things personally and put in a list of people that you might like to talk to. And that's the first step before you do any writing, is figuring out what you might like to write before you sit down to write it. If you've enjoyed this one and you want to learn more about how you can gather, learn, and then turn this content into compelling content for your book, make sure you subscribe. We're going to share interesting things every week about how I teach people how to think differently about the atomic elements of their book to build up into what becomes a great nonfiction book.
On a piece of paper, write down one thing you got done today.
Ooh, that's a great one here.
And hold it up.
I got it.
And I'm going to do the same thing.